Um, Thank you for joining us for Critical Conversations, a series organized by the School of Communication and Multimedia Studies, which we see as a platform for generative discussions of this very fraught time in our history. Our panelists today are Jason Hallstrom, Director of the ISense Lab at FAU, Susan Schneider, Deitrich Professor of Philosophy and NEH Public Scholar, and of course our featured speaker, Julia Dressel. I'm Gerald Sim from Film and Media Studies, and I'm leading a seminar on ethics and politics of AI this semester. And to my students who are here, yes, it's all going to be on the exam. Big thank yous need to go out to our sponsors, the ISense Lab, and the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. We're so happy to have Julia with us today to talk about a topic that is about as relevant to 2020 as any topic can be. She is the co-author of a Science Advances study that exposed a popular algorithmic criminal risk assessment tool for its racial bias and inability to outperform human prediction. In other words, the algorithm, which was used in Broward County, no less, was not very good at being an algorithm. Her article received global media attention from New York Times, The Atlantic, The Economist, Mother Jones, among others. Julia started her career with Apple, but left to work on criminal justice reform at Recidiviz, a tech nonprofit based in San Francisco, building data analytics tools to power decarceration efforts.
So this is Zoom.
Julia has prepared a presentation for us. At its conclusion, I'll bring Jason and Susan into the conversation, which I expect to churn up some ideas from the audience. There will be plenty of time for your questions, at least 30 minutes, probably more, for Julia and the rest of the panel to field your questions. Please pose your questions in the chat box, and you'll see some instructions there. And with that, please take it away, Julia.
All right, let's get this presentation. Great. All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm happy to be here, and I have planned for this to be around 30 minutes, might go a little bit over, but hopefully we'll definitely have tons of time for questions. So today I'm going to be talking about the danger and power of data-driven decision-making in the criminal justice system. And I know that the kind of publicized title for the talk today was AI and Fairness in the Justice System. As I was putting together this presentation, I'm going to talk about the research that Gerald mentioned, and then also the work that we do at Recidiviz. And this seemed like a more fitting title, but I promise we will touch on AI, also fairness, and a lot about criminal justice system. So in the US today, in courts and also just pretty much all criminal justice agencies across the country, there is software that is used to help people make decisions. And most of the time, this software is what's called a recidivism prediction instrument. And data about usually a criminal defendant, could be someone who's in prison, who's in the system already, demographic data, criminal history data is fed into an algorithm which produces a risk score. And these risk scores quantify the likelihood that this person will recidivate, which is the likelihood that they will commit a new crime at some point in the future. And these risk scores are then used in bail decisions, sentencing decisions. They can be used in parole decisions, all over the place. In May, I believe, May of 2016, researchers at ProPublica exposed that there were some troubling aspects to one specific risk prediction software called Compass that is in use in Broward County, Florida, and is used in a lot of places. And what these ProPublica researchers found was that the mistakes that Compass was making were deeply unfair to Black defendants. And they basically found that the Compass software was more likely to detain a Black person, even though they would not go on to commit a new crime in the future, and more likely to recommend releasing a white person, even though that person would actually go on to commit a new crime in the future. And this gained tons of attention at the time and gained my attention also. And the thing is with algorithms and specifically their use in the criminal justice system is that people, for the most part, assume that algorithmic decision-making is inherently more accurate and less biased than human decision-making. And it's not surprising that tools like Compass and other algorithmic tools are deployed at many stages of the criminal justice system because of this assumption that they are inherently superior, that they are definitely more accurate and definitely less biased than the humans who are making all those types of decisions. So after reading the ProPublica article, myself and a colleague, Hani Farid, who was at Dartmouth at the time, he's now at Berkeley, we started doing our own research and thinking about the use of recidivism prediction instruments within the justice system, but we were surprised, we couldn't actually find any research that proved that algorithmic recidivism predictions were inherently, or like that proved that they were not inherently, that proved that they were actually superior to human prediction. And because tools like Compass that are used, to decide whether somebody should be released on bail before their trial, they have huge implications on people's lives, we thought that it was pretty imperative that we actually confirmed that tools like Compass were actually outperforming human prediction. So the goal of our study was to determine what the baseline is for human recidivism prediction and then see whether or not Compass actually outperforms that human baseline. In our study, we ran our study on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which, if you're not familiar, is basically online crowdsourcing marketplace where you can pay people to perform some short tasks. And for the study, we used the same data set from Broward County that ProPublica had used that determined that Compass was exhibiting these racial biases. And so we had all of these people from Broward County that Compass had made an assessment on. We had the score Compass had given these people. So in our study, we recruited a large group of people on Mechanical Turk. And for each person, we showed them a bunch of people. We showed them a little paragraph, not pictures or anything, just a paragraph about the person, some demographic information, their criminal history, and then the crime that they were recently arrested for. And we asked them, do you think this person will commit a new crime in the next 2 years? And they would guess yes or no. And we were able to then compare those human predictions directly to what Compass had predicted on those same exact people. And we found that Compass's predictions were not more accurate or less biased than the human predictors that were on Mechanical Turk. Compass's accuracy on that group was 65.2%, and the human predictions reached a 67% accuracy. So completely the same. Compass is not more accurate than this random group of people that we were paying $1 to complete this online survey, which was very shocking to us. This is a very shocking find. And what am I doing next? Yeah, so that was the first thing we found, was that this commercial software, it's built by a for-profit company. They're called Equivant, and it's used all over the place, and that it didn't outperform these human predictions. And so then we started thinking, we were like, that's strange. What could they be doing? Like, what's inside this software that it's not more predictive than people who we assume have basically no criminal justice experience? And Compass, because it's a proprietary software, doesn't share the inner workings of the algorithm. And so we decided to try to reverse engineer it a bit. And so it is, because it's a proprietary software, this is why there's a black box on this slide, is that one of the concerns with the use of tools like Compass is that they are what are considered black boxes, which means that when a judge is seeing a Compass score in front of them, they don't know what features of a person's demographic information or criminal history or anything were used to compute that score. And it is so basically having an understanding of what's actually going on can help not only us figure out what is actually happening in the prediction, like the making of these predictions, but also can help judges know, okay, this is what is being used to produce these scores. So we decided we wanted to try to reverse engineer it a little bit to poke into it, see how these predictions were being made so that they were being made in a way that these non-experts could actually match their accuracy. And what we found was that we could match entirely Compass's performance with a super, super simple linear classifier logistic regression that only took in these two features. So all we needed was somebody's age and the number of prior crimes on their record, and we could match Compass's accuracy. And this was also very shocking for us because this is, again, this commercial software, and they've fought lawsuits against their proprietary nature of their tool. And we were able to reproduce exactly whatever they're doing with just a two-feature classifier. And so whatever it is that they are doing, it's not more sophisticated than this very, very simple predictor. And first, this, I think, brings up the importance of transparency, of what's in the secret sauce of these algorithms that are getting marketed all over the places, built on big data and super sophisticated machine learning algorithms. And especially when tools are used in the justice system to make decisions about what's going to happen to a person, those people being able to have an understanding of what parts of their criminal history or what parts of their identity were being used against them to make those decisions, I think is really important. But more importantly, the fact that we were able to replicate Compass's decisions with only these two features helped us understand why Compass has these racially disparate outcomes. And so what our classifier learned, and what we assume Compass also, I mean, these are, it's criminal history and age, I assume, are also part of what Compass is looking at. What our classifier learned was that if you are young and you already have a lot of crimes on your record, then you're higher risk of committing a new crime in the future. And if you're older and you have no crimes on your record, then you're lower risk of committing a crime in the future. And we were able to, reach that same accuracy as Compass by just using that logic. And in the US, if you're Black, you are more likely to have more crimes on your record. Black people in the United States are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate that is 5.1 times that of white people. And a lot of people hear that and their first thought is like, okay, well, Black people must commit that much more crime. That's the reason why they're incarcerated at much higher rates. However, this incarceration rate difference is not entirely explained by difference in rates of offense. And a good example of that is that Black people are almost 4 times more likely than a white person to be arrested for the same drug offense. And these national racial discrepancies in incarceration rates we see in the data set that we were using. In the ProPublica Broward County data set, the white defendants in that data set had on average 2.59 prior convictions, and the Black people in that data set had an average of 4.95 prior convictions. So you can see that the Black individuals in this data set were way more likely to have more prior crimes on their record. And this reflects the state trends as well. Broward County, which is in Florida, in Broward County, the incarceration rate of Black people is over 3 times higher than that of white people. So, oh, there we go. Coming back to this, you can start to see how Compass had these racially disparate predictions happening, because the Black people that Compass assesses are more likely to be classified as higher or medium risk because they're more likely to have prior crimes on their record. And white people are more likely to be classified as lower risk because they're less likely to have prior crimes on their record. And even though number of prior crimes is one of the most predictive features of recidivism, and we're not the only ones to have found this matches a bunch of other studies have found that one of the strongest predictors of future criminality is past criminal history. And so even though it's one of the strongest predictors, its predictive strength is not that strong. And you can see that by the fact that our classifier reached about an accuracy ceiling of 65%. Compass has an accuracy of around 65%. So it has some predictive strength, but not a ton. And so that means that these predictors make a lot of mistakes. And so because the Black people assessed by Compass are more likely to be risked higher, and the white people assessed by Compass are more likely to be risked lower due to these national trends in incarceration, the Black people who do not go on to reoffend, the non-recidivists, are on average classified as higher risk than the white people who also do not go on to reoffend. And the opposite is true. The white people who do go on to reoffend, the ones who end up being recidivists, are more likely to be classified as lower risk than the Black people who also go on to reoffend. And this is the false positive, false negative discrepancy that ProPublica initially found. We also saw it in our human predictions and also in our own built classifier predictions. And it's entirely because this is the most predictive feature. It's what our humans were probably looking at. They're like, oh, how many crimes has this person committed? They'll probably commit another one. And so it shows how this two feature classifier gives us a lot of information on how those racial disparities come about. So the thing with recidivism prediction algorithms are very, very necessarily trained on decades worth of criminal justice data. And in this country, that decades worth of criminal justice data shows the people that are incarcerated again and again and again. And recidivism prediction algorithms are trained on that data, and they are told to learn which types of people are incarcerated again and again, which types of people are the ones that will then go on to be back in prison. And so as I said on that previous slide, going through various incarceration, racial disparities that we have in our country, it is, I think, pretty close to impossible to build any algorithm that doesn't reproduce those same disparities. If you're asking it, learn who was incarcerated again and again in the past, and then show me who's going to do it in the future, they are going to say, okay, I'm going to assume you want the future to look exactly like what it did before, and they're going to reproduce those same discrepancies. So, don't want to say anything before I move on to Recidiviz. Yeah, a couple takeaways that I have personally from this study in particular was, one, the super, super strong need for any type of regulation in this space. A lot of times, criminal justice agencies are sold tools like Compass in the same way they would be sold Microsoft Office, and they will go through the same kind of technology procurement process. And until recently, there hasn't been much of a conversation about how these tools are regulated and what kind of, if any, accuracy thresholds they need to pass before they're used, or what validation studies must happen and what validation from a fairness standpoint has to happen. Also that there needs to be a lot more transparency in what goes into these algorithms. I should also say that since this study came out a couple years ago, almost 3 years ago, since then, Equivant has actually released the 6 features that they do use in Compass. I don't think they've shown what weights are being used anywhere or what kind of algorithms they're using, but they have shown what the inputs are to Compass, which is great. But even if we have transparency, even if we have high amount of accuracy, it is going to be really hard and maybe mathematically impossible to build any machine learning technology that doesn't learn the structural racism that our criminal justice system was built to withhold and to uphold and reproduce those same inequalities going forward. So this study came out, 3-ish years ago, and I was working at Apple at the time and knew that I really wanted to be working either in criminal justice reform or in the space of regulation of AI. and happened upon, random, long story, happened upon this group, organization called Recidiviz, and at the time was an entirely volunteer organization. And Recidiviz was an open source nonprofit technology company that was trying to get off the ground, and immediately started volunteering with them and knew right away that this is exactly the kind of work that I wanted to be doing. Recidiviz is a, like I said, open source tech nonprofit, and we build data analytics tools to power decarceration efforts. And I love talking about risk prediction tools and what Recidiviz does in the same talk, because I think that they really show a very, very different approach to the use of data in the criminal justice system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the products we've built, some of the work that we're doing, and I think that it shows there are very different ways to approach data-driven decision-making within the justice system. So a lot of the work that we do is with direct relationships with state governments, and state governments know that things are bad. They know that they have prison overcrowding. They know that they've had just skyrocketing recidivism rates, and that they are under pressure to decarcerate, either legislative pressure, or a governor has said, I want to close a prison, or they have been told, the voters have voted, we're not paying for any more prisons to be built, so you have to figure out how to get your prison overcrowding in control. So they know things are bad. They have been putting data into databases for decades. They have to to be operational. They've been storing data about where everybody is, who's been in prison, who's been on probation and parole, et cetera, for decades. But they have, for the most part, old data systems and not really the technical capacity or analytical capacity to do anything with that data. And it's really common for State Department of Corrections to operate where they get one report every year, months after the year is done. So they'll get a report about 2020 in March 2021, and they'll go through it and they'll be like, okay, that's already 3 to 12 months ago or 16 months ago, not useful for me anymore. So it's very rare that any decisions that are being made at the state level are using any data. So we come in at the direct, like right under the governor, sometimes at the governor level, right under the governor level. And we start working with this entire state, and we help them set a measurable decarceration goal, like closing a prison, or a lot of the work we do is with reducing revocations, specifically technical revocations. So revocations are when somebody's on probation or parole and they violate some type of rule on their supervision, and they end up back in prison. And a bunch of people end up back in prison just for violating technical rules. So they miss a curfew, or they forget to tell their parole officer they've moved, something like that. And so we'll come in, set decarceration goals with the state, and then we deploy our platform, which means that we deploy our automation of bringing in all of their data. So they give us access to all of the data from everyone who's been in prison or on probation or parole in the state. And we've automated that process of bringing it in, and then also the calculations that we've built on the schema we've built to describe the whole criminal justice system. And then we use that data and those calculations to build products to influence the decision-making that's happening in that state to go towards those goals. And we use mostly in these tools a lot of descriptive analytics. So describing what has happened and what is currently happening. And we are able to establish baselines, which is rare in that space because there isn't a lot of technical capacity for knowing, oh, this is the rate that people are actually successfully completing parole over the last 10 years or in the last 12 months. And with creating those, establishing those baselines, we can help them then create goals based on those baselines and then actually look at the progress over time. And because we're getting data from them either daily or weekly, they're seeing in real time, are the things we're doing working or not? And they can shift if it's not working. And they know, oh, we're going away from this goal that we've set as a state and this goal that we've publicized that we're going towards as a state. And that helps to create this culture of internal accountability because there are reports that are happening all the time saying whether or not they're tracking towards the things that they've committed to. And beyond internal accountability, something that I'm very excited about is, our work to also create external accountability. And this summer, we launched our first public-facing website. It's called the Spotlight Dashboard for North Dakota. And they gave us basically permission. We worked with them to figure out exactly what was going to be on this dashboard. We have a public-facing dashboard that has counts of every single person that is currently in prison, on probation, and on parole in North Dakota. We have historical information of how the population has changed over time. We've got rates of how much of their prison population is because of technical revocations and other kinds of revocations. So this is super exciting because this is going towards a place where not only does the state have their own understanding of how poorly they're doing or what they need to be working on or how they're trending towards their goals, but we can also start having states holding each other accountable and the public holding the state accountable because there is an awareness of what's actually happening. And from my own research in criminal justice, it is really, really, really hard to get criminal justice data that is usable and workable. And so we're also working, there's some data you can download with this public facing dashboard, but we're also working towards opening up data for research and advocates. That is usually super hard to get. And one of the entire pages that we built on this public dashboard is this racial disparities page. And we are able to highlight the specifically against Black and Native Americans in North Dakota, disparities that are happening at various points in the system. Oh, excuse me. When COVID hit first in March, the state prisons, we knew were like, oh no, this is gonna be really, really bad in prisons. And so we super quickly built a COVID projection model specific to prisons. And it takes into account the fact that you're modeling the spread of COVID within a prison and not within like a regular community. And at the time, we had been working with like 4 states on that intense like state relationship that we do, that's the core of our work. And then we, in like 2 weeks, expanded to working with 34 state Department of Corrections. And the states that worked with us saw 3 times higher the number of early releases. So the biggest thing that our tool helped people do was look at their current affected cases and specific to like what the age distribution is in that prison and plan the number of people they were going to release on specific days and see how their curves of who could get sick and who would end up in local hospitals, et cetera, would change based on the number of people that they were releasing. And this gave them reports that they could bring to the governor and say, we've got to get people out, otherwise we're going to have a disaster. And so the states that were using our tool to make those reports released over 3 times the number of people than the states that unfortunately weren't working with us. But another project that I'm super excited about is our Spark policy impact modeling. So this is taking mostly publicly available data. This isn't like the individual level data we're getting with states. This is stuff that's completely public, and we are able to forecast the projected impact of various state legislative policies. And we impact the 5-year financial or fiscal impact, like the savings of the state if they pass the policy, and then also the decarceral impact. So how many people will not be in prison, how many people will not be on probation or parole, and the number of life years that people will get back not being in prison. And I wrote this number down so I wouldn't get it wrong. The policies that we are helping, one has completely passed in California, got the governor's signature, and that one is going to save the state, I think, a little bit over $2 billion. And overall, the policies that we're working on could help save states over $3 billion and get 30,000 people out of prison and reduce the supervision population by 90,000 people. I think that's over the next 5 years. And we just started this project in August. So this is a way that we're using data analytics to push for the changes that are going to have the maximum decarceral impact. And the great thing about decarceral impact is that it also saves states money, since states spend a ton of money imprisoning people and supervising people. And so it's easier legislation to push through because it's not only saving money, it's also getting people out. So overall, Recidiviz products are designed to power data-driven decisions towards decarceration. And when you hear data-driven decisions, you might also think, well, Compass and recidivism prediction algorithms are also data-driven decisions. They learn trends in historical data, they take in data about a person, they help making decisions. And I think comparing the two can be super useful, like I said, in thinking about the different theories of using data in the criminal justice system. So Compass, or just in general, criminal risk assessments, I would say, are examples of predictive analytics at the individual level. So they're making a prediction about one specific person. And Recidiviz, for the most part, is doing descriptive analytics. Some of the things we're doing are predictive. The modeling, COVID modeling, and policy projection modeling is predictive, but at a system level. And overall, risk assessments are training on decades worth of data that represent the structural inequalities in the system. They assume the future is going to look like that same past, and they take a single person and they say, how much do you look like all of the people who haven't had a chance to stay out of prison over the years, and then make a decision about how risky that one person is based on how much they look like that group. And in making those kinds of decisions backed on that kind of data are inherently going to reinforce those discrepancies. They're going to say, you have a ton of crimes on your record because you're Black. We think that you will probably end up in prison again, and so we're going to higher risk you, which means you're going to be held in bail or held in jail before your trial. You're going to lose your job, et cetera, et cetera. It makes you harder to be successful. You get out of prison, it goes on. And the opposite, I think, is the way that we are using data at Recidiviz is first not an individual level. We're never doing individual level predictive stuff, always system level analytics. And the most important distinction, I think, is that we exist because we want the future to not look like the past. We know the extent of the mass incarceration problem that we have in the United States and the extent of the racism that is in every step of the system, and we exist because we want to make sure that that ends and that our future does not look like what our past has looked like. And we do get individual level data in those state relationships that we have. We're getting very rich individual level records of which prisons people were in for which days when and where. But we use that, and we get demographic information, et cetera. We use that to power very rich system-wide analytics. And we are helping to make decisions about what's going to move the whole system and what's going to get the most people out. And then also that bottom point is that we also have an ability to bring attention to the inequalities in the system. And you can see that in that racial, you should check out the North Dakota public dashboard. It's great. I can maybe put a link in the Zoom chat. Yeah, we have the opportunity to show these are the things that are happening, and these are how these decisions have impacted different types of people in different ways. So, coming back to the original title, or the original advertised title of this talk, which was AI and Fairness in the Criminal Justice System, I have a couple of points before we end. How long did I go for? Oh, perfect, 30 minutes, okay. Well, the word AI is used very broadly, I would say. People use the word AI to talk about what's actually artificial intelligence. They use it to talk about what's machine learning. They use it to talk about super simple, just linear predictors, which I guess is also machine learning. Or they use it to just talk about tech, which is fine. Totally fine. We can use it to just kind of any tech that's used in the criminal justice system. I think that we need to be thinking about not only the first thing we need to be thinking about is what data it's being trained on, but then also you need to really have an understanding of the context of the decision that it is informing. And so what kind of decisions are being made? A very different decision is being made when you're thinking about whether to pass a policy that is going to eliminate mandatory minimums for a whole bunch of drug crimes. You are saying, we are no longer incarcerating people for this entire thing, and you're making a big decision about a big group of people, about the whole system to shift in one direction, versus I have somebody in front of me and I'm going to punish them for something that they haven't done yet because of how much they look like people who in the past haven't had a chance to not do the wrong thing. And so I think the context and where a tool, what decision a tool is helping, what decision the tool is helping someone make, is really important. I also think that with any tech in the criminal justice system, well, tech in general, but specifically in the Silicon Valley, has a very big techno-chauvinist problem, which is that there is a assumption that technology is the solution for everything. And a lot of times that's not the case, and we can't solve all of our problems, especially social problems, with technology. And there are definitely problems where tech can help. And at Recidiviz, our philosophy is not that we are the answer to mass incarceration, because it's so big, there are so many things that have to happen for this to be dismantled. But there are definitely problems that we can help solve with the tech that we've built. So understanding like what is actually the shape of the problem, what actually could be done better with technology. Understanding historical trends of why people have been sent to this prison, great use of technology. And then where are there places where there are more non-tech solutions to the social problem that we're looking at. And then going to the word fairness, I think there's a huge debate, and I didn't really go into it in this talk at all, but huge debate in the mostly academic, but also in the advocacy world about how to measure fairness in an algorithm. And there are tons of mathematical definitions of fairness. Some people have shown that under certain conditions, multiple definitions of fairness can't be met at the same time. And I think those are really important conversations, and we should have conversations about mathematical ways to measure fairness, but we also should be having conversations about systemic oppression and how something that you're building is affecting the people that have been most oppressed by that whole system. And not just like, is this one thing that you're doing mathematically on this 1,000 person data set that you're looking at going to even out and not have imbalanced false negative, false positive rates, but what is the decision that this tool is helping, and should we be making that decision with the use of technology in that context? And then what was the last thing I wanted to say? Yeah, that might be it. That's not a very elegant way to end this talk. I forgot exactly what I wanted to say at the end. Yeah, that's it. That's all I had to say. And now I think we have tons of time for questions, and I can end this. How do I get out of here?
All right, thank you, Julia. I'll start with one immediate question that I had. So you mentioned techno-chauvinism in your last section there, and I wanted to talk about this study that a bunch of researchers at Stanford, mostly at Stanford and one at Berkeley, published in response to your original study.
Yeah.
Because they seem to say, no, the algorithm's just as good or better. And, you know, just from my point of view, they seem to be looking for ways to kind of validate the algorithm. So did you have a response to that study?
Yeah, I didn't put it in the talk because I knew you were going to ask that question. Well, first of all, not in the study itself, but in a bunch of the interviews and the articles that have happened with the authors of that study after, they have clarified that they are aware of the concerns of the use of algorithmic risk prediction, and that they do not think just because of their study, we should, algorithmic risk prediction is fine again, there's no issues, carry on. So first to say that. This study, the first thing about this study was that they validated our results, which was awesome. They were able to replicate exactly what we did, and they got the same results. So that was great to see. And what they did find was that under a couple circumstances, algorithmic prediction could outperform human prediction. One of the assumptions that they had was that in our study, we had, we showed people how they were doing as they went through the task. So we showed them what their cumulative accuracy was as they went along, and they were given a pay bonus if they were able to reach a certain accuracy, and that helps incentivize people to actually pay attention and try. And they said that they felt it was unrealistic for people to have feedback during the task, because in the criminal justice world, people don't always see whether their prediction about somebody was correct. And I didn't feel like that was a fair statement to make. I think judges see all the time the people that end up back in front of them. Probation officers see all the time whether the person that they, they did a risk assessment on someone and they said, okay, like you can be low risk if that person ends up causing problems for them later. Like they get feedback and they learn over time what traits about people are indicative of the fact that they are not going to be able to stay out of prison. So that was the one situation where they were able to find the algorithms were better than humans. And then most of the other examples they had where the algorithms outperformed humans were in these low base rate scenarios. So in scenarios where you're predicting violent crime instead of just recidivism in general. And in these scenarios, there were only like 10% positives in the whole data set. And so a naive classifier learns that immediately. They're like, oh, the classifier says, oh, I can predict no every time and get 90% accuracy. That's the best thing to do. And humans, even if you tell them this, you should only guess yes every once in a while, like they were telling them the base rates for these types of crimes. Humans are really hard. It's really hard for us to not predict no every once in a while, or yes. If you've predicted no 9 times, you're like, okay, I gotta get a yes in there somewhere. There's no way that these are all no. So that was my thoughts on that study. And I think the authors more were surprised at our results from a standpoint of the fact that so many studies over the years have compared actuarial, actuarial statistical assessments with human assessments, but not specifically in the recidivism risk prediction area. And so they were just showing like, okay, even though humans can do it, we shouldn't be relying entirely on humans maybe. Sorry, this is a long answer, but my biggest takeaway, honestly, from their study was that everyone still has a horrible accuracy, even disregarding the low base rate scenarios, because I think that that's not that interesting, but on the actual regular base rate scenarios, their classifiers were still around 65-70% accuracy, which is really bad, especially when you're considering that people are held in jail for weeks because of these things, and they have very, very serious life implications. And we shouldn't say, oh, this classifier was able to get 72% accurate and these humans are down at 68, and so we should definitely go with this other thing that reproduces these biases, but that we put way too much trust in, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's my takeaway on their study.
I think just as important, these contracts, right, that the county signs with Equivant, for example, it costs money. It definitely costs more than $1 a day that you pay for a Mechanical Turk, right?
Oh yeah, they cost money. In most cases, they actually cost money per assessment. So we get a lot of, actually, at Recidiviz, we get a lot of risk assessment data that the state has stored, and we'll get assessments that are not finished because probation officers know that their department has to pay if they finish the assessment. And so they will intentionally not complete them so that they don't have to pay. I've also heard, I should have mentioned this in the talk, but I've interviewed a lot of probation and parole officers in rural Missouri and North Dakota, and they have told me, oh yeah, I'll absolutely fudge the results or the inputs in these risk assessments, because if somebody's risked too low, they don't qualify for treatment programs in the state. And so I know they absolutely know which scores need to be high and which scores need to be low in order for somebody to go into a certain risk level category. And so they are not only, when they're done correctly, have problems with bias and accuracy, but even in the general case, they are pretty untrustworthy because the people who are administering them, it's usually like a interview style you're asking somebody questions and writing stuff down, they are also putting things in that are not accurate, so they can manipulate what happens with the results.
Okay, thanks. Let me throw it to Jason and Susan if you have any questions for Julia.
I do. So Julia, that was fabulous. All the power to you.
Thanks.
In the last year, I've been working in Washington, D.C. with Congress on AI policy.
Amazing.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Ask the chair, and I'm so glad to learn of your work. And believe me, I will be sending some emails after this conversation.
Love to hear that.
Yeah, we need to keep in touch. I mean, but what I have is a question for you. It's a hard question, but I mean, as you know, algorithmic bias is a major concern right now in DC. And, you know, California's had some forward-thinking AI legislation. And, you know, the situation that you trace with recidivism is only one instance of algorithmic bias. I mean, it can go, you know, runs all the way to mortgages, for example, who gets a mortgage. And so what I'm wondering is, if you were to write legislation about how to deal with biased algorithms, can you maybe offer 3 or 4 simple pointers that you think would actually be feasible?
That is a tough question. My first thought is I think that there needs to be okay. I don't know how I'm not a legislative person, but anything that is a technology that is used in a context where there has been I guess maybe proven to some extent systemic bias about certain groups of people, it is going to be really hard to make any algorithmic tool that is not perpetuating that same discrimination. And so mortgage is a great example. The people that haven't been able to get a mortgage are then the people that don't qualify are then more likely to get loans that they cannot pay for, et cetera, and then they are classified as the people that they shouldn't be giving loans to. It's a, cycle. And so I think that there may be like some type of legislation is in certain situations, if there has been proven systemic discrimination against certain groups, that there needs to be clear decision criteria that is not an algorithmic prediction, that is transparent of like, these are the decision criteria that are being used to determine whether somebody qualifies for something or not. And those decision criteria need to be looked at with respect to those historical trends. And so if there is one of those criteria that you can show, probably mathematically, if you use this criteria, you are going to discriminate against this same group of people. And it's hard because a company is going to not want to remove that, because they're operating from a profit standpoint, and they are not going to want to make the ethical decision that is going to allow people that they have deemed too risky to actually get access to the thing that they are gating access to on those decision criteria. So, God, I don't know. I mean, they use like outlawing use of anything that could be a proxy for race, like zip code, prior crimes. What's hard is that you start going through things that could be a proxy for race and you end up with not that much because of the current racial situation in our country. But any statistical proxies for race should be eliminated from that decision criteria. I don't know what else I would say. I'm such a skeptic with individual level prediction, because in so many situations, I think that it's going to do the same thing that recidivism prediction algorithms do. So my advice would be to ban it, but that's tough because so many companies rely on it.
What about a combination approach? I mean, algorithms in dialogue with humans. I mean, we've all heard stories about parole judges who make, lazy decisions toward the end of the day. So they grant more parole in the morning, and when they're cranky right before lunch or whatever, they're like, no. I mean, humans are notorious. So what about something that puts us in check, but isn't the decision maker?
Yeah, potentially. I am so much more in favor of using statistics to understand the extent and the patterns of the problem historically, and then passing legislation to fix those problems. And so I think that what New York did with bail specifically was really great, is they said, we're not going to replace bail with an algorithmic risk assessment. We're going to say every single misdemeanor and nonviolent felony, you get out of jail before your trial. No bail. The judge cannot set bail. And so that is taking an awareness of the fact that if you try to put in all of these things to figure out if somebody's too risky to be released, you're going to reproduce those biases. So instead, they are saying, nope, we are, with an understanding of how this decision has played out in the past, we are going to release every single person that was brought in on a misdemeanor and a nonviolent felony, all of them. And they have very, very, very small rules for who can be held and who can be detained and who a judge can post bail for. And so that's what I mean with those decision criteria, is that if you can say, nope, we're outlawing the ability for you to make any risk assessment on people using X, Y, and Z, and instead you have to make super clear decision criteria that give most people the benefit of the doubt. That would be my answer to that one. Yeah. Hard question though. Thanks.
Jason, would you like to follow up with anything?
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. So first, Julia, thanks so much for your talk. It was really outstanding and important work that you're doing. Particularly appreciated your articulation of the significant differences between predictive and descriptive analytics, and how those differences are brought to bear in a context where you're making decisions about a human's life. So this is really fantastic. I have two quick questions. There are many other, I think, more interesting questions that are waiting to be answered, so I'll keep them short. So the first question, and you touched on this a bit, about explainable AI. So there's been a lot of talk, particularly from the DoD, about funneling investments into so-called explainable AI. I'd be very interested in hearing, particularly at Recidiviz, whether explainable AI is making its way into the descriptive analytics. So DoD has been focused much more on explainable predictive analytics. So I'd love to hear whether or not that's something that's coming into play for the descriptive analytics. And then the second question is whether Recidiviz, not even Recidiviz, but whether, I would like to hear your thoughts on the connections between the diversity of the computer science pipeline, which is historically, shallow and narrow. I was looking at the stats just this morning. I don't have the 19 stats, but in 17, we have 3.1% of bachelor's degrees in computer science going to African-American students. So the numbers are, they're horrible. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And thanks again for your presentation, really spectacular.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so first, your first question about descriptive analytics and explainable AI, the good thing about descriptive analytics is that it is pretty impossible to make it non-explainable. That was a double negative, but basically you are describing what is happening, and so you have to know the decisions that you made to make that description. So we're classifying, we're classifying prison admissions by whether or not they were from a new crime or from a revocation. And you can see all of our code is open source. You can go and step through the entire thing and see this is exactly how we classified this admission as a revocation versus a new crime. And so we have to have tons of documentation for the states we're building something for the policy modeling. We have to be able to say, this is the data that we got. These are the decisions that we made to classify this as X and this is Y, and this is why this graph has 5 different categories. And so descriptive analytics, I feel like, is very inherently explainable because you had to make those decisions at every step of the way. Versus when you're building predictive, it depends on the kind of predictive analytics, right? Because if you make a linear classifier that has 6 inputs, that can be explainable if you let it. You can say, these are the features, these are the weights that we're putting on each of these inputs. And so if you have, this is exactly how much your prior crime number is impacting the score. When you're building, neural networks, that's where there's a lot of research into, okay, how can we build something and give it the ability to figure it out, to figure out what the best way to make this prediction is. Because we don't know. That's why it's figuring it out. That's the power of building like a neural network. But then also after it has built itself, be able for it to tell us, okay, this is what we did. And I think it's an exciting field. It's definitely exciting problems to solve. I don't think explainable AI is the answer to a lot of the questions that tech is being asked to solve. And so I think that tech is being thrown at so many human problems, and we're distracted by, okay, can we know exactly what the weights were used in this function, instead of looking at the actual historical context and cultural context of the decision that this Department of Defense is making things that are going to kill people, thinking about like, why do we want this to exist in general, and why do we want it to be able to make a decision about who it's going to shoot or not? And maybe we need to be asking different kinds of questions. And so then going into your second question about diversity, it's a huge problem. It is, I would say, from a tech, a lot of things I can say about this, which is a good plug for our talk. When is it? In a couple weeks, I'm having a talk. She's here, I forget who, Andrew Miller, we're chatting, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department, about women and feminism in tech. And there, what are the main points I want to make about this? One, it's not a pipeline problem. Tech companies that are like, we can't find these applicants, is bullshit. At Recidiviz, our engineering team is, I believe, 60% women right now. I should actually get the actual diversity stats, but you can go to our About page and see who we are. And it's because our founder's a woman, and I was the first hire, and we were women. So by the time we were 3 people, there were 2 women. And so it was super easy to hire another woman, because she's like, oh, I'm going to join an engineering team. They're going to be 2 women. Amazing. And so then suddenly we had an engineering team that was 60% women, because people are like, oh, absolutely, I want to go work on that team. And we just kind of partitioned our engineering team into different sub teams working on different projects. And I'm currently on a team with a female product manager, a female tech lead. I'm a software engineer. We have another female software engineer, and then we have a female designer. And it's awesome. And it is just because people want to go work on teams of other people that look like them. And so if you make the effort to bring in diverse talent, then that will be how you get diverse talent. There's obviously also, you have to treat people in ways that they want to stay at your organization. You have to hear when a Black person comes to you and says, we cannot build this thing because it is going to perpetuate systemic racism. You have to listen to that person and give them the power in that organization to be able to raise alarms. And the other thing, I could talk about this for forever, but the other thing that I think is really important is that when you do have diversity in those tech rooms, people start asking different kinds of questions. And they're not only asking like, what's the most efficient way to build this? Or what is the what's the optimal way we could design this? But they're asking like, I am wondering about how this is going to affect the people that this is being used on. And we're making a tool for parole officers. And I am worried that if we're reminding them about the people that they should be discharging, this is one of the tools we're building right now, is reminding parole officers about the fact that they can recommend that people get released early. How can we make sure that we build something that's not going to make them pay attention to people that are not doing as well and increase those revocation rates? And so I just think that there are different kinds of questions that people bring into the room when you have more diverse engineering teams.
Thanks very much.
Which is to say that this female engineering team, we've got racial diversity, but we do not have any gender diversity in our all-female team, but it's fine, it's great.
All right, let's get to some audience questions. First takes us back to issues of political economy. Do you have any insights about private versus public prisons in your work, whether that affects recidivism rates at all?
Whether it affects recidivism rates. I've heard some argument, I think this was like Joe Lonsdale or someone who's trying to get private prisons. They believe that if you have private prisons and they're monetized in a way where the prison who could make the least, like the low, can like help people have the lowest recidivism rates are being the most successful, basically. I'm not sure, that's kind of this argument. I am I'm a believer in the fact that we need to be dismantling the prison industrial complex, and that we are not going to end mass incarceration when we have more and more financial interests financially and physically invested in the growth of the system. And so the huge issue with private prisons is that they are not invested in getting the prisons smaller. When you have public Department of Corrections that's paid for by taxpayers, well, again, actually private prisons are contracted by the state also, but the Department of Corrections can be more invested in the reduction of the system because they are drowning, and because there's so many problems. They have, like, just, you know, from a PR perspective, endless negative PR because of the problems that are in their system. And the private prisons are only incentivized to continue the growth of the system. You're gonna see a lot, and we're already seeing a lot of private prison companies starting to invest in alternative forms of imprisonment, which is mostly like electronic supervision, like electronic monitoring, as prisons start to decarcerate more and people end up on supervision. You'll see that too.
Well, the previous question was from Doug McGetchin, but that segs us into a question from Andrea Miller. Could you situate Recidiviz's work within, you know, in more detail within ongoing conversations about reform and abolition? In other words, whether it's taking material power away from the system or just giving it new tools?
It's a great question. I personally identify as an abolitionist. There are plenty in our organization that do. We, as an organization from a public facing standpoint, do not. We're an apolitical organization. And however, we are a decarceral organization, and that means that we exist to make the system smaller. And wait, let me look at what the exact wording is. The concerns that people always have when they first hear about the kind of work we're doing is that we're working with State Department of Corrections. They're like, wait a minute, there's no way you are a decarceral organization if you are working directly with these state prisons. That doesn't make any sense. And the answer to that is that these are the institutions that have all of the power, not all of the power, a lot of the power. And they have all of the data on what is actually happening, and they have the power to make decisions to reduce the size of their systems. And every single state that we've come in to work with, they have been excited. They've been so excited to work with us. The fight to end mass incarceration is pretty bipartisan. There are a lot of differing motivations. Like I said before, there's a lot of financial motivations that costs a lot of money to have people in prison and to supervise people. And so there are a lot of, from financially conservative positions, that we shouldn't be spending that much money on prisons. And so one thing that we have done in the States, so our early funding was from foundations, and some federal grants. And as we're expanding to work with more states, we're actually signing contracts with those states that are tied to the size of their system. And so they are incentivized to reduce the size of their system because they are paying us a percentage of what their system, the size that their system is. And so we are trying to make our financial incentives aligned with their financial incentives aligned with decarceration as well. And something that we say at Recidiviz is that the goal of our organization is to no longer exist. Like, we want to all work ourselves out of a job, and we want to get to a place where there's no need for us to exist as an organization anymore.
When you described the makeup of your team, so it took me this other topic. Recidivism rates and predictions are different for men and women, right? So how have developers of software such as Compass or Recidiviz accounted for that difference in their models? Or even if you have, right, to what extent is your modeling still kind of based on gender binaries?
That's a great question. Yes, in some states that we've seen, there are gender specific risk assessments because the incarceration trends are super different between men and women. The gender was an input in both the classifications that we built and also in the, I'm positive it's one of Compass's inputs. I'm not positive, but I would be very shocked if it wasn't. And in our study, we showed people the gender. In our schema at Recidiviz, I forget if your question was Recidiviz focus, but I will answer this anyways. We allow for female, male, trans female, trans male, and any other string, any gender string that we encounter within the system, we will figure out a way to map it. And so we have have a data understanding that actually has an understanding of humans and the fact that gender is not binary. And so unfortunately, we're in the business of classification, which is a whole other issue. Again, come to this gender studies talk, but in our data schema, we have allowed for more than just a male or female gender binary, which is great. And we've also allowed for people to be listed with more than one race and ethnicity, which is rare in data analytics. Usually people are put in with only one race or ethnicity. And something that we do that I think is important to talk about is in certain metrics that we are putting in products, from a statistical standpoint, it isn't statistically valid to count people towards more than one race or ethnicity. And so in those cases, we look at the state census population, so what the race and ethnicity distribution is in the state census, and we surface a person's least represented identity. So if they are in North Dakota and they're listed as being both Black and Native American, we are going to surface, I think Black people are less represented in North Dakota, so we'll surface their least represented identity in that state.
Okay, we have a question from Nicole Morse. Have you explored applying your approach within the field of sex offender recidivism predictions? Currently, the main tool used is the Static 99, which is essentially a 10-question tool that labels anyone who is gay, queer, trans as 10% more likely to reoffend. I can imagine that your approach could provide a much better way to understand the problem of sexual violence and harm, although there's little public or political pressure to act on that area.
Oh yeah, it's a great question. I have seen, we have data on Static 99, and this is the most widely used recidivism prediction for individuals with sex offenses. This is, well, I'm wondering about the question. I can imagine ways that your approach would have, I'm wondering what Nicole means by my approach or our approach in this question. But this is like the first thing that comes to mind here is the way that historical understandings of who is dangerous, of who is a criminal, of who is a type of person that should be labeled as someone that we need to be incarcerating or that we need to be punishing, then gets encoded in these decision-making criteria, and then that discrimination then gets legitimized in these tools that then say, nope, this is our actuarial risk assessment that's showing that this person is more risky and needs to be over supervised. And so I'm not shocked that one of these questions embeds discrimination against queer and trans people. And it's part of the reason that I am so wary of any use of these individual level predictions and how these like decision-making criteria can reinforce these issues.
Nicole, if you wanted to clarify.
Yeah, if you want to clarify, go for it.
Unmute yourself if you wanted to do that. or maybe she stepped away. Let me kind of refocus the kind of line of questioning back to tech and method. A very kind of popular response to instances such as the one you exposed is that there is something wrong with the training data. That is to say, the algorithm is reaching conclusions based on information that's either generated or mined through some kind of biased process, right? Is this valid, or is something wrong with algorithmic design, or something social, or something systemic? Because that could, because that response seems to inoculate the field from a deeper kind of critique, right?
So, I'm a broken record, but the context is super important. So, a couple examples here. If we're talking about a Google image reverse image algorithm that is learning what a wedding dress looks like, and that algorithm has only been fed pictures of white women in white dresses, and then they see a dress from a traditional Indian wedding, and this algorithm has never seen this kind of wedding dress before, so it doesn't know that this is also a wedding dress. And so that is a situation where that answer is completely correct. Yes, this is an issue with the training data. The data that was fed into this classification algorithm did not have a diversity that actually represents the diversity of human experiences, and it's not prepared to be able to classify anything that's not a white heteronormative idea of what a wedding dress is. And we've seen also this issue with one of my favorite examples is the earlier versions of the Apple Watch were really bad at detecting the accurate heartbeat of people with darker skins. And at Apple, where I worked, Apple is obsessed with secrecy, and everything is very, very secret and covert, and it's how they are able to build products that surprise people and stuff like that. But the group of people that were used to, test the Apple Watch initially is probably Apple C-suite and the team that built the Apple Watch. And go look at Apple C-suite. I doubt that there are enough people with enough melanin in their skin to be able to show that this Apple Watch is not accurately detecting somebody's heartbeat. And so those are situations where, well, that's not really training data, but that's like, well, no, sorry, that is exactly training data, because it's like, oh, let's get a bunch of people's heartbeats and then figure out how we can model it and track it, etc. So there are absolutely situations where the training data is the issue, and that the training data isn't representative of what the actual experience is, or what like actual life looks like. And so then it's shown things that it's not prepared for, and it doesn't know how to do it. However, there are so many situations where the training data is not the problem. And that one slide that I had that showed how the incarceration rates by race in this super small 7,000 person Broward County data set reflect the state trends, they reflect the national trends. And so that doesn't matter how big of a training set that you get there, you're either gonna have a training set that accurately reflects the lived experience and the structural racism that is in the criminal justice system, or you're going to manufacture some data set where they have equal levels of incarceration between white and black people, and then you're not going to have any predictive validity because you aren't actually representing what's actually happening in the system. So sometimes I think it's a super accurate response, and other times the problem is there are always going to be issues with this type of prediction because of the context in which it's being used.
Thanks. I had a follow-up to that. I mean, on the topic of secrecy, right? How are these risk assessment tools and results or reports circulating within the system? Like, who gets to see them? Like, do defendants know? Do they get to see them?
It's a great question. There was one lawsuit, I believe it was in Wisconsin. I'm from California, so my knowledge of the states in the Midwest is poor, and I apologize. I think it was Wisconsin, where somebody was, I think it was Compass, it was definitely recidivism risk prediction tool, was used, the score was used in, I think, their sentencing. And they, what exactly? They sued because it was not, because they were not able to be told what parts of their identity were being used to produce this score. And so, and I think that they ended up losing this law. I should really know this. I should really know how this played out. But the answer to your actual question is that in most cases, they don't even know. So in pretrial cases, they may know. I bet it depends on the state. It depends on maybe the judge. If the judge is like, oh, I see on this paper you were scored as high risk, and so I am going to keep you in jail without any bail. I'm not sure, actually. I'm not aware of any like regulation, or I guess that legislation on like whether people get to know. But I do know that there have been tons of issues with scores being held against people in trial or in sentencing situations, and they don't get to understand where those scores come from because of the black box nature of most of these algorithms. Yeah, but it depends on the context. So these are used all over the place. And when people are being admitted to prison, there's a lot of prison programming that's determined based on risk scores, and prison segregation that's based on risk. And when people are on probation and parole, there's levels of supervision that are based on risk. At that point, people definitely have an awareness of what risk level they fell into, but still, I don't know if it's really explainable why they ended up in one place or another. Although some people know, they've been assessed so many times that they know exactly what's going to happen. Yeah.
All right. Our next question comes from Eileen Feidelman. Do you consider practices through education or mental health or counseling in jail to end recidivism? Like, I assume when she asks, do you consider practices, I guess, in your modeling or in your research?
Oh, so great question. We have been asked to model the impact of in-prison programming. Is this maybe the question?
I think so.
Yeah. One of the early things actually that we were brought in to do in one state was to look at the in-prison treatment and anger management and employment programs that they have, and try to see which ones were working. And they can, with that data of like, oh, this is impactful and this can lower, people going into this program can reduce recidivism by 20%, that helps get funding for that kind of program. And so they were asking for us to try to figure out if there were programs that were actually having an impact and how they could help get more funding for those programs. And it is super hard to do that kind of analysis for tons of reasons. One, it's always hard to try to establish causality, and trying to figure out if, equivalent comparison group, what's the right word? I'm not a data scientist. Yeah, groups that you can compare to, looking at like, oh, people that were like equally qualified for those programs but didn't participate in the program, but looked enough like the people who did participate in the program. And we were trying to do this with a post-release program actually in one state. And what we found was that the data was just not good enough. And so we do have really good data on like where people were and who was in what prison at what time, because they need to know that. But the data on specific types of programming is very variable. And so we just didn't have enough data on people doing treatment and educational program and employment programs specifically. So we've definitely talked about it, tried to do it, haven't done it, but would like to be able to do some type of analysis on that in the future.
Andrea had another question about your original study. Could you talk a little bit about your decision to use Amazon Mechanical Turks, and how you negotiated that decision ethically in the context of your research?
This is a horrible answer, but at the time, I had no idea what Amazon Mechanical Turk was. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. I don't even know. 4 years ago. And the professor I was working with, Professor Hani Farid, had used it. It was an easier way to get people that were not just, and this is a thing that tons of studies fall into, is that all of the people that are in the study are college students that are doing it because they have to in that one college town. And so from a demographic standpoint, pretty homogenous, age-wise at least. But so we were trying to not just test a bunch of Dartmouth students, and we wanted the study to be a little bit broader than that. Since then, have become much more aware of the exploitative nature of Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the fact that they the contract workers that are people that filled out my study that make a living on Amazon Mechanical Turk have very unpredictable wages, absolutely no benefits, and no ability to have certainty in the fact that they will be able to pay their rent and eat that week. And so if I was doing this again, would probably try to find a better way, a more ethical way to conduct this study. But that is the answer to that question.
I have a question about the UX end of this, right? So
yeah.
The decisions to pay for and adopt this software, are made by humans, right? And the decisions on how much weight to put on certain scores are, again, those are human decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on how these decisions are informed by just human relationships with numbers, whether they like them, hate them, or afraid of them, right? To what extent does that make the problem of, software that's not ready worse?
So that's one of the issues with the implementation that has happened with risk tools, specifically in, I'll stick to the courtroom example. So judges seeing risk scores. Obviously, each individual judge has their own relationship, how good they are with numbers themselves, and how much they either fear or trust technology, and how willing, they might be a kind of person that's like, I don't trust this number. I've been doing this for 40 years. I know exactly what this person's going to do, even though that decision that they're making in their head is entirely filled with the biases that they have from their own lived experience and from their demographic and racial identity. So part of the problem with the implementation is that this technology has been just, implemented all over the place and gone through the same type of procurement, like I said, that any other kind of tech does. And there are not a lot of structures in place to how much weight these should be given. Should they be used entirely? Should the judge have absolutely no discretion and no ability to override? Should they have to be able to list like 3 things in order to override the recommendation of a score? I don't know. Those kinds of things have not been legislated. And so you have the issue of the untrustworthy accuracy and the bias that are in all these predictions. And then on top of that, you have how judges are going to interpret those scores, whether they're going to point to a score to justify a decision that they were going to make anyways. So they're going to make a racist decision. This algorithm is telling them, yep, that's the right thing to do. And then they're saying, oh no, I wasn't racist. I'm following what this software told me. Or are they going to only override it in cases where they are going to make opposite decisions? So that is a huge other problem, is that from the court, also parole board standpoint, the actual regulation of how those numbers are used entirely depends on the situation of the person, which is scary.
We have a question from Ravi Bahara. Have you considered any methods to debias data before it's used in algorithms?
So this is actually, interestingly, where I started personally. After I read the ProPublica article, ProPublica was the first, and those researchers were Julia Angwin and Jeff Larson. They were incredible, the work that they did, mostly to do all the public records requests from Broward County and clean this data set. And it has been used over and over again because of the lift that they did in that research. And my first question, this was early when I hadn't done any research in criminal justice at all. And the first thing that I started working on was, okay, how can we build a recidivism prediction algorithm that's aware of bias? Can we have an understanding that it's optimizing for accuracy as well as predictive parity, is that predictive parity? I always forget which one's which. Basically as balanced false positive, false negative rates. And I kept falling into this trap with this specific data set, which, who was this? John Kleinberg, I think, was who figured out that when there are differing base rates of something, so in this data set, it was differing base rates of recidivism. There were higher rates of recidivism in the Black people in that data set than in the white group. When you have different different base rates, it's mathematically impossible to build an algorithm that has the same accuracy and matched false positive, false negative rates for both of those groups. So basically, like in that data context, it was impossible to have high accuracy and equal accuracy for those groups and also not avoid the kind of bias that ProPublica originally found. And so that's where I thought it was kind of a side answer, but to the actual question of like, have you tried to remove bias? There are just some situations where the data that you're using is a reflection of larger biases, and you're not going to be able to do anything with that data that can be independent of that structurally racist context. There, you can't take it out because it's in all of the variables that you're using, and it's in the trends, it's just baked in. And if you tried to balance that data set in a way that wasn't biased, you would be removing anything that had any sort of predictive strength at all.
Let me kind of start to take us out with a question about your biography, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the fact that you were a double major at Dartmouth in computer science and women, gender, and sexuality studies.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the decision to leave Apple for Recidiviz. Like there seems to be a tension in that personal story, or a kind of ethical drama, if you will. Could you tell us a little bit about these decisions in this context, in this specific context, right, to help our audience kind of think about their own relationship to history, right, during which, you know, at this time, many people may be thinking about what they can do, right, because you clearly made a decision that you're going to do something. So what, you know, what was going through your mind? Like, you know, like tell us about like the decision, right? These are big decisions, right? To leave Apple for Recidiviz, for example, right? Just take us through that decision-making process.
That decision. Yeah, I will say there's this professor and author, his name is Mark Howard, he's at Georgetown, and he said some quote in a talk I was listening to a while ago that was like, once you start learning about the injustices of our own criminal justice system, you can't look away and you can't stop. And that was true for him, and that's been true for me and everyone at Recidiviz and everyone that I've ever met that has started to, you know, they've read one book, probably The New Jim Crow. They probably read The New Jim Crow, and suddenly they're like, oh no, things are really bad, and you can't look away anymore. And I had done this research, and this was my first kind of entrance into learning about the criminal justice system. I was fortunate to grow up where I didn't have personal experiences with anyone I knew or loved ones being wrapped into the system. And so this was the first time I started learning about the extent of the problem. And then was working at Apple and I was a front-end internal tools Mac OS developer, which is a lot of words to basically mean that I was working on the internal apps that Apple employees themselves use. And I was like making a button be the right color blue. And I was, you know, I was doing UI development, but I was just building stuff that I just was, building these things that seemed so unimportant, and knowing that there were such awful things happening that there were so many other things I could be doing with my time. And was thinking about going to law school, was just trying to think of anything else that I could do besides the job that I was doing. And then as soon as I was at a conference on AI and ethics and human rights or something like that, and met somebody who had been volunteering for Recidiviz, and he was like, oh, your research, you may be interested in this data startup that I've been volunteering for. And as soon as I learned about Recidiviz, I was like, I will quit my job tomorrow, please. As soon as you have any money, I will leave and do this thing. And so I think that it's like just the extent of the mass incarceration problem in our country is so, the extent is so large, I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but it's so bad that once you really start learning about all of the ways that it's bad and all of the ways that it's not going to get better, unless a lot of people do a lot of things, you realize there's a lot you can be working on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Question,
That kind of takes us to the end of time, but I want to avoid, right before someone hits the big red button and everything goes silent. I want to invite everybody to unmute yourself to give Julia and our panel a round of audible applause. All right.
I put the link to the North Dakota Public Dashboard in the chat. Take a look at it. There's a lot of good stuff in there. And recidiviz.org is our organization. You can go read the policy memos that we've published that we're helping get passed. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And also another plug for, I forget what the date is on this talk that we're doing, but look out for it. Feminism and Women in Tech.
November 12th.
Yes, November 12th.
Thanks a lot, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.